older designs actually did shunt it to ground, and I think it blew a fuse or whatever, and it was much easier to fix than replacing a big expensive BGA chip. So yeah, oops. And this leads me to a comment on Lewis's video. This is from an older video where they talked about this, and this person, Rainy Days, I think where they can see where the error arose in this case. Here we go. No single design engineer is responsible for the design from start to finish in a large corporation. That's very true, especially in terms of something so complex like a MacBook Pro. There's no way only just one person did the schematic and the layout and everything else. You've got at least one person doing the schematic. The schematic might have even been divided up. You've likely only got one person doing the PCB layout, because cooperative PCB layout, it's great in theory, doesn't really work that well in practice, but it's possible. But it's most likely that, I mean, that MacBook board that was seen, not particularly a complex layout. One design engineer
Hold your
can
fire!
do that, and it's better if you have the one design engineer do it. So they might have had a PCB layout person, but that PCB layout person might have had absolutely no visibility into the schematic side of things. Anyway, let's continue. The error started with the CAD librarian, responsible for drawing schematic symbols for new parts and maintaining them in the library, who incorrectly labeled pins 1 and 43 to be far apart numerically when physically they are close together. Now, this is interesting because if we have a look at the connector here, this is actually from the Apple schematic, and it's actually drawn. There's two ways to draw a schematic symbol like this. One is as they've done here, a physical representation of the connector, and you can see the backlight power is up the top here, and they physically show that as a separate pin. There's a box around here showing that these are all signal pins, and this is a physically separate power pin. And of course, that's what you see on the connector. There's one big larger tab pin. So they've actually, I don't see any fault whatsoever from the librarian point of view, who would have drawn this schematic symbol. Now, you could argue that why did they number it? Pin 1 and 43 up here. Well, it might be understandable, because you might start labeling the signal pins first, and well, is that a thing? I don't know. They don't show the other one down the bottom, which is interesting. So maybe there's a bit of inconsistency, that other large pin down the bottom. So maybe there's a bit of inconsistency there in terms of drawing the schematic, but that's not where this problem originated. So I don't put any fault on the librarian in this case, even if it is a pin number like this. The person laying this out, the pins actually, even though the pin numbers are there, they've physically put it next to that. And any competent design engineer, especially ones familiar with the connectors in these types of products, you'd have to be when you're designing these types of products, they would have gone, oh yeah, that's probably the larger tab at the top of the connector, and you've worked on other designs and you've got physical examples in your hand, and yeah, it's like, I can't see any error happening there. The person who drew the schematic knew that that backlight pin was close to this auxiliary power pin. But they might have had, or they may have had the decision of buying the connector. They certainly would have had visibility. This part number up here would have been mapped. They could have gone and checked out the data sheet. Apple's internal library systems almost certainly would have linked to a data sheet for that particular product. They'd linked to the 3D model and a photo, and everything should be linked together in their system. If it's not, I'd be very surprised. But they should have, the person laying out the schematic should have known that that pin was physically close to there. So that if you could blame anyone, it's the person who did the schematic, knowing they would have known that pin was physically close. So that's the first goof. You probably should have said, well, let's skip the pin down there, because look, we've got lots of ground pins down here, tons of them. You don't need that many ground pins to, in this particular case, they're twisted pairs, so it's not like they're getting shielded in between the individual ones or in the individual pins or anything like that. So really, they could have shifted all that down, and it wouldn't have, it wouldn't have mattered. You could have got at least pin 1 and pin 2 there as ground, so that you could have a guard shield around it. But obviously, they weren't in that mindset when they were designing this. So I don't think that's a valid criticism. A completely different mindset, what the librarian had. The librarian is probably following the company standard. They probably would have had something like, oh, connectors must be physically similar to what they look like, rather than just numbering them 1 through 50 or whatever, and then not having a physical representation, just one big row like this, and not even having 2 sides separated. So I don't think the librarian was at fault there. When this is passed on to the layout engineer, person responsible for actually routing the design on the physical board, he routes the design blindly and does not catch the error because he does not know or really care about how the circuit functions. That can be very true. There's nothing that says a PCB layout person has to be, well, they have to have electrical knowledge, okay, but they're not necessarily a design engineer. I've worked with excellent PCB layout people way in the past, and in fact this was a carry-on. They were originally CAD engineers. They were AutoCAD, and then in the early days of CAD they'd come over and they'd be laying out PCBs without really much electrical knowledge. It's more important these days. You've got to know about, you know, impedance control and twisted pairs and termination, loop area and star grounding, and you know, there's tons of stuff you have to know as a PCB designer. So I'm not necessarily sure the PCB layout person would route it that blindly, but I wouldn't blame them for not capturing that problem. And I think if you're going to blame anyone here, it would probably be the schematic designer, which is more of the main product designer, because you can say PCB design is just more former professional PCB designer myself, and I hate this term, but grunt work, right? Laying out the board is kind of, right? It's the bigger picture, actually designing the schematic, designing the product, the overall look and feel and the physical form factors and how it all goes together and the thermals and the whole, you know, things like that. So the higher level design engineers, they were really responsible for ensuring that those pins didn't have a guard ground between them, for example. Or that the backlight wasn't fused. I haven't looked at the rest of the schematic. Is the backlight fused or whatever? If it's not and it didn't have a ground path going to ground, then yeah. When the board goes through testing, nothing is ever caught since nobody has the foresight to purposely try to short a design during testing. And that can be quite right. But when you're designing, and you've been designing, Apple have been designing consumer products for a long time, they should know about water ingress, especially MacBook computers, right? People pour stuff on the keyboard, it gets in there and it ruin your day. It's a common failure mode, but is it the mindset of the company, in this particular case Apple, that look, we don't care about if they users dumb enough to spill water in them, hey, we'll sell them a repair service where we'll replace the whole motherboard, replace the whole lot, or we'll just sell them a new one. And that's, you know, so Apple have some blame there from that point of view. But do you blame the design engineers for not mitigating against water ingress like this? Because it's not just the 52 volt supply. You could actually get electrolysis happening on other rails as well, and that could ruin your day. So really, how far do you go to ensure that that backlight wasn't going to go into another chip? With hindsight, it seems obvious. Yeah, don't put it right next to a 52 volt rail right next to a data pin. That's just, yeah, asking for trouble without having some sort of ground guard trace mitigation in there to shunt that power into ground instead of it going into your big BGA processor or whatever. So with hindsight, it's obvious, but do you blame them? Yeah, it's hard, right? But once they know about this problem, yeah, if they don't fix it, then that's a problem. Ultimately, this is a flaw due to a misunderstanding, mismanagement between multiple engineers with different functions. This would never happen in a smaller company where the design is owned by one person from start to fab. So Apple, being rich and large, actually works against them because all the engineers that work on the board need to have the exact same design philosophy, or at least adhere to the same standards. This is basically true. It's, yeah, when you subdivide your tasks up, everyone kind of, it's common just to wipe your hands, throw it over the wall, so to speak. Oh, finish the schematic, job done. throw it over the cubicle wall to the layout engineer, and then they do the layout. Then they throw it over the wall to the production engineers, who then have to get it assembled and built and tested and all that sort of jazz. So there is that silo aspect to a large product design. But like anyone in the chain here could have seen this potentially, and then did they speak up? Maybe they didn't say, hey, I think this is a problem, or hey, I'm hearing on the forums that these notebooks are failing due to water ingress, and it's always this line here, and it's causing a problem. Maybe we should fix that on the next revision, or maybe we should be careful on the next revision. But then maybe they're rotating through design engineers, so the 2012 MacBook Pro design team may not have been the same as the 2016 MacBook Pro design team, or one person left, or it's not documented, or there's no company culture at the engineering level to actually look at this sort of problem and go, hey, okay, what happens if water ingress? Water ingress is one of the big failure. You can do failure mode analysis on these things, and you could argue that they certainly should on a high volume, expensive consumer, big profile consumer product like this. A common fault everyone knows is spilling water and coffee and whatnot on your keyboard. If that gets in, what happens? But hey, they could have tested this and looked around and went, hey, it's not a problem. Like I said, don't necessarily blame them for missing this, but once they know, should certainly fix it. This flaw is still, of course, unacceptable and can be remedied with better communication and a set of internal design philosophy standards. And that's certainly true. You can implement a failure analysis on these things where you can look at a design, and in fact, you could have somebody devoted to this or a team devoted to this once you've designed your first prototype of your product. Right. How do we make this thing fail? Do they care about that? Or do they simply blame the customer for getting water ingress? And then even if you do identify this problem, well, you can, route this out. We're going to change the pin out of the connector. We're going to make this a ground pin. We're going to have guard traces around here. We might even remove some of the solder mask on the traces to actually do that sort of thing. But then it might happen somewhere else. And but you've seen the board here. It's a reasonably complex board. There's just tons of connectors in here. There's just tons of things going everywhere. And well, it's not just about the high voltage backlight. Other issues, other electrical failure modes, and other, there's just tons of stuff that can go wrong in here. But this one, with hindsight, seems blindingly obvious. And you could argue, and I wouldn't argue against it, that, yeah, it's a pretty dumb design to put the 50 volt supply right next to this like this. If it was a 3.3 volt backlight or something like that, had a large bunch of parallel LEDs and was just really high current, you wouldn't have had this sort of issue, although you might still get some electrolysis happening between the pins and stuff like that. And that could ruin your connector, ruin your day, and you might have to clean it up or do whatever, but it's not going to go in and take out your CPU or whatever. What does it do? Did it take out the CPU down here or the MUX chip? Apparently, if you've got one of the designs, it only takes out the MUX chip, which is the MUX, I don't know which chip it is, but it could be like that one or something. And it's a much smaller and simpler chip to actually replace than, say, the CPU over here, the massive big BGA jobby over here. Yeah. And then do you go even further and go, oh, well, we're going to get, look, this connector's here and it's near this joint on the top of the keyboard, and if water goes in here, it's always going to go around. I'm just guessing here from the field. I don't know what a MacBook Pro looks like and assembled. But water always gets in here. So maybe we should partially conformally coat this board, for example. That's an extra production process. I don't think I've ever seen a conformally coated consumer notebook computer. Maybe they did in those Panasonic Tough books back in the day or something like that. I don't know, but that'd be a drastic over engineering measure. Or do you add physical routed out slots in your PCB between the pins to prevent, you could actually do that. You could leave this pad off here and the pad's on the connector. You could actually put a big routing path right through here, so you had no pin 1 pin, but you had a big slot. You could have it right down here like this, as a matter of fact. If you just left pins 1 and 2 unconnected, you could have a big massive slot down there, and the pin just flaps around in the breeze. It's just happy, it'd be fine, just happily sitting above that slot, no worries whatsoever. And then you just get this big, so there's no creepage across your board like that. It'd have to creep over to here. You can see that on this side of the connector, there's nothing over here really that you'd have to worry about. The creepage paths are very large, so maybe they could have done that, for example. That would have been an obvious option. But then they could have done their water ingress testing, for example, and found that, well, water didn't get under these connectors and it could have tested fine and ship it. And maybe it's only 1 in every 10 cases of water ingress where water actually migrates its way into this connector because people like spilled something in there, for example, and it's got the top cover on the connector, and then they went and, you know, stored their notebook upright. They folded it up and, you know, I don't know, shoved it into their bookcase or whatever, or did whatever, stand up vertical, and then the water flowed off the board and then down into the connectors. And does it happen in every single case? So you can't, so you don't know. They could have actually tested this and went, yeah, no worries, that's fine. And in that case, no, you certainly can't blame the engineers at all. So we really don't know unless whoever was on the design team here. But if previous ones, if they actually thought about it, or it was just luck where it actually shunted that power from the backlight to the ground, whether or not they deliberately thought about that, or it was just luck of the design and they just didn't think about it in this one at all. But no, there's certainly many cases where I've done designs and we've tested it thoroughly, and multiple engineers look at it, we do a failure analysis and we figure out all the different ways it can fail, and it still finds some unique way to fail. Or we did actually test that particular thing, but it only fails 1 out of every 10 times. And of course, you're not going to test it 10 times. You're going to, oh, you're doing it a few times, or you know, Murphy's Law. It'll get you every single time. So anyway, it's an interesting discussion about the infinite variability in layout and things going wrong, and whether or not you do failure analysis, whether or not it's good enough, whether or not your mitigation issues are enough. But yeah, this one seems a bit dumb with hindsight. But are they to blame? Are the engineers to blame? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments. So thanks, Lewis, who you subscribe to. I'll link it in at the end of the video. It'll show up there somewhere, Lewis's videos. And let us know what you think about this whole schmozzle that is the Apple product design. And of course, but yeah, Apple really need to lift their game. They're not even off the floor. They need to at least lift them off the floor out of the to make products more repairable, and the right to repair bill, which Lewis is involved in, and all sorts of stuff. Very important. And anyway, there's lots of interesting stuff, and we could go deeper down the rabbit hole if you really wanted to, but I think we'll call it quits there. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that video. Found it interesting. If you did, please give it a big thumbs up. As always, discuss down below or over on the EV blog forum. Catch you next time.
Just stay focused, guys. Are you fucking insane? What the hell is this?